What if the world goes to war with Russia over Ukraine? To understand this question and the weight that it holds, we need to first understand what the heck is going on with Russia and what the heck is going on with Ukraine. This in itself is a complex question and requires a little bit of a history lesson to answer. Ukraine has only been an independent nation for just over 30 years, starting in 1991. This, however, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a deep and rich history to it, because it certainly does. The reason it hasn't been an independent country for longer is because it's consistently been under fire from other nations. Whether it be the Austro-Hungarian forces, Poland, or the biggest aggressor on Ukraine, Russia, it feels as if Ukraine has always been an area of interest to other countries looking to expand their territory. In 1991, it finally gained its independence, though, due to the fall of the Soviet Union. This was a long and tough road for the Ukrainian people. Over the past century, they had dealt with many occupations, a full-on horrible genocide that transpired in the 30s by Joseph Stalin, which frankly doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and many other horrific and trying times. Needless to say, the Ukrainian people were very happy to get said independence when 90% of them voted to make it so in 1991. The Russian people weren't as happy with all this, though. Since Ukraine had been on and off under Russian control for so long, there are some very deep ties with Russia. Ukrainian culture is very similar to Russian culture, and a lot of the people that live in Ukraine were originally of Russian descent. This is part of the reason why Vladimir Putin and the Russian government doesn't even look at Ukraine as an independent nation, but simply as an extension of Russia. That's why Russia has always been trying to interfere with Ukraine's attempts at joining international organizations to stop their claim at being an independent country. We also need to touch on what took place in 2014 when the Russian government annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula was always an area of deep interest to Russia because of what happened in 1954. In that year, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic transferred the Crimean Peninsula over to the Ukrainian SSR. When Ukraine got its independence, they retained this state until Russia annexed it in 2014. Russia has always felt like it belonged to them, largely because most of the population of the state were originally Russian and therefore decided to take it back a few years ago. This was in violation of many treaties that the Russian government had previously signed, though, and obviously didn't make the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian people very happy. Since that point, tensions between the two nations have continued to escalate, and now there have been serious rumblings about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is because Russia has just so happened to move roughly 100,000 of their troops to the border of Ukraine in what seems to be the preliminary stages of an invasion. Other world leaders have accused Russia of planning to invade Ukraine, with Biden coming out and saying he will move in. Russia, however, has denied these allegations and basically said that they're allowed to move their troops around in their own country to their heart's desire. This isn't wrong, but it doesn't take a genius to see that something is a little fishy here. With all of this being said, if Russia does decide to invade Ukraine, what's gonna happen? Okay, so before we all hit the panic button, I do want to say that most experts and analysts don't think that Russia's going to invade Ukraine yet. The reason they think this is just simply because the juice may not be worth the squeeze in this scenario. If Russia was to attack Ukraine, then some of the other world leaders have made it very clear there would be measures taken to stop said invasion. NATO would get involved, and this conflict could erupt into something very bad and deadly very quickly. Basically, it wouldn't be quite as easy as how it was in 2014, and Russia would certainly suffer some serious losses. It should also be noted that sanctions are already in place with Russia and some key countries, and those would obviously get far more restrictive if a war was to take place. However, even though there are sanctions with some countries to the west, it's thought that Russia believes they can weather this storm by increasing trade with countries to the east, such as China. This is theoretically possible, but an invasion of Ukraine would definitely cause a storm of problems Russia may not be willing to take on right now. Now, even though this is what some experts are thinking, we need to factor in what some of the other world leaders are coming out and saying publicly. Biden has come out and said he believes Russia will be invading Ukraine very soon. Boris Johnson has come out and warned about such an invasion, saying that it would be painful, violent, and bloody business, whilst also making it very clear the UK would commit troops to NATO NATO if an invasion did occur. So even though analysts still think some well-enforced sanctions and diplomacy can work all of this out, there is a real threat here, and we should all be starting to pay attention around the world. Now, let's assume it happens. Let's assume that Russia invades Ukraine. What happens next? Well, first off, Ukraine is gonna need some help. BBC released a great image comparing the military strength of Russia and Ukraine, and it's more than clear who has the advantage here. 4.5 times the number of active soldiers, roughly 15 times more attack aircraft, way more tanks, way more vehicles, pretty much way more everything. So if Russia was to invade Ukraine and Ukraine got no help at all, then one would have to believe eventually Russia would emerge victorious and take over the country. However, if we believe what we're currently hearing from other world leaders, then Ukraine wouldn't be by themselves. They would have the assistance of NATO. The Week published a great article on January 25th posing the question of who would win in a fight between NATO and Russia. In that article, they write, research published in 2019 by the Royal United Services Institute found that British forces would be comprehensively outgunned in any conflict with Russia in Eastern Europe. The RUSI found that the British Army and its NATO allies have a critical shortage of artillery and ammunition, meaning they would struggle to maintain a credible defense position if Russia were to opt for all-out aggression. At present, there is a risk that the UK, unable to credibly fight, can be dominated lower down the escalation ladder by powers threatening escalation, said RUSI's report. But the UK wouldn't need to stand alone against Russia, and NATO's biggest player, the US, has an overwhelming advantage over Russia in conventional forces, Russian military analyst Alexander Goltz told Deutsche Welle. While Felgenhauer agreed with Goltz's assessment of the US's military advantage, he warned that open warfare often comes down to far more than the inventories that each side of the conflict can call upon. He told DW that it's like predicting the result of a soccer match, adding, yes, basically, Brazil should beat America in soccer, but I've seen Americans beat Brazil in South Africa at the Confederations Cup. You never know the result until the game is played. So basically, it's thought that if there was to be a full-on aggression from Russia that escalated to a point where all of NATO was committed and all of Russia was committed, then NATO should come out on top, but upsets happen all the time and nothing is a guarantee. This is part of the reason why experts think Russia will hold off before invading, because you never really want to start a war if you're the underdogs unless you have to. But back to the question at hand. What if this happened? Well, if you live in North America, one would think that you should be fine, at least for the time being. However, there is one massive factor that we haven't even considered in any of this so far: China. How will one of the world's superpowers respond if Russia and NATO are engaging in a full-on war in Europe? Even though China probably doesn't care about many of the core issues between the Russians and Ukrainians, this war would definitely end up affecting them. Western sanctions on Russia would find a way to affect China and most likely force their hand to pick sides. This becomes a massive variable in all of this, because I don't think anyone has any idea how involved China would get in a conflict like this if it did happen. It's clear that China's relationship with Russia is stronger than it is with the US, but is it so strong that they're willing to fully go into war? No one really knows until it actually happens. That's why, sadly, the answer to this question is almost impossible to know for sure. Pretty much all we can say is what the world leaders are telling us right now. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said, "We've been very clear that if there is any further Russian aggression in terms of sending Russian forces into Ukraine, there will be a swift, severe, and united response from the United States and Europe. And therefore, that's what's going to happen." What happens after this step is honestly anyone's guess. I would hope that NATO would be able to stop Russia from invading the country, but anything can happen, and with the amount of other variables on the table, such as other countries whose intentions are currently unknown, it's really hard to say how this war would develop. Although I can say almost certainly that gas prices would probably go up a lot, so that's something we can all look forward to if the world goes to war with Russia over Ukraine. What if Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow? If you've been checking the news recently, then you've probably heard that Russia and Ukraine are aren't in the best of relations right now. The two countries have had their differences for decades, and it seems as if Russia has finally had enough. To understand what would happen if Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow, it's important to do a little history lesson on why Russia is considering attacking Ukraine in the first place. Most wars these days are fought over one very powerful and important resource: money. Typically, almost every conflict we see can be boiled down to human greed and the desire for more money and influence. Although this is certainly a factor here, I wouldn't say that's the main reason why Russia is interested in attacking Ukraine. The main factor here is history. You see, Russia and Ukraine, even though they're feuding right now, were once very close. So close, in fact, that they were basically one and the same. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and was governed by Russia. This is why, if you trace the lineage of many of the Ukrainian people, you'll find that a few generations ago they were actually from Russia. Because of this, Ukrainian culture is very similar to Russian culture. Their capital city, Kiev, is said to basically be a whole nother Moscow or St. Petersburg. This isn't to say that Ukraine doesn't have their own rich and historic culture, because they certainly do. The thing with Ukraine, though, is that they've pretty much always been fighting for their independence. If you look back at Ukrainian history, there's really no extended periods of time where this country is not under attack or under rule by another country. They just happen to be smack dab right in the middle of Europe in a highly contested area from a lot of strong neighboring countries. During the last century, they've suffered from several occupations, a full-on genocide from Joseph Stalin, and tons of other atrocities that should really get discussed on the world stage a lot more. This adds to the fuel of the Ukrainian people and their deep and very warranted desire to be their own independent country. If we take a trip back to 1991, we saw this on full display when Ukraine had a vote for their independence. In that vote, 92.3% of people in Ukraine voted to be independent. Think about that. 92.3%. It's hard to get 92.3% of people to do anything, let alone vote on something as in a country's independence. Either way, Ukraine has been independent for just over 30 years, and from all accounts, they want to keep it that way. Russia, however, has made their intentions of taking over very clear. Actions speak louder than words, and their actions in 2014 when they annexed the Crimean Peninsula showed the world exactly where their heads are at. The world let them get away with that, but it doesn't seem as if the rest of the world leaders are going to sit back and allow them to take over any more of Ukraine once again. So, with all that being said, what if Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow? Okay, well, first off, I want to pump the brakes a little bit and say that I don't believe that Russia will be invading tomorrow, but it could be happening very soon. Joe Biden also doesn't think it could be happening tomorrow, but he's under the impression that things could go down in February. BBC writes about the potential of invasion by saying, US President Joe Biden has warned there is a distinct possibility Russia might invade Ukraine next month, the White House says. Russia, meanwhile, says it sees a little ground for optimism in resolving the crisis after the US rejected Russia's main demands. The buildup of tens of thousands of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders in recent weeks has stoked fears of an invasion. Russia denies it is planning an attack. The US president made the comments in a telephone conversation with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Thursday. President Biden said that there is a distinct possibility that the Russians could invade Ukraine in February, White House National Security Council spokesperson Emily Horne said. He has said this publicly, and we have been warning about this for months. During their talk, President Biden reaffirmed the readiness of the United States along with its allies and partners to respond decisively if Russia further invades Ukraine, a White House statement said. Mr. Zelensky said they discussed recent diplomatic efforts on de-escalation and agreed on joint actions for the future. So that's what the BBC wrote, and even though we can take solace in the fact that things may not be going down tomorrow, we also need to start worrying that these threats could be very real. If they attacked literally tomorrow, though, then what are the immediate actions that would follow? Well, NBC News writes, with more than 100,000 Russian troops deployed on Ukraine's border, President Vladimir Putin is keeping the West guessing, will he opt for a full-scale invasion or a more limited operation, or simply keep Russian forces in place to maintain pressure on Kiev and the West. Enjoying an overwhelming military advantage over Ukraine's smaller, less advanced forces, Russia has a variety of options if Putin decides to launch an attack, depending on what Moscow wants to achieve, the price it is willing to pay, and how the West responds, experts say. With With Russia's formidable air and naval power, any offensive would most likely feature bombing raids, missile strikes, and cyber attacks that could devastate Ukraine's military infrastructure, disrupt communications, and pin down ground troops. There's an incredibly large force that's on the border, much larger than the one that invaded and annexed Ukrainians' Crimean Peninsula in 2014, said Philip Breedlove, a retired 4-star US Air Force general who was NATO's supreme commander from 2013 to 2016. You have a Ukrainian land army that's gotten much better, much more capable since 2014, said Breedlove, who is now at the Middle East Institute, a Washington-based think tank, but the Russians would own the air and the sea. So if Russia attacked tomorrow, we would most likely see how this war is going to shape out. Are they trying to do small targeted attacks, or is this a full-on invasion with tanks and planes rolling in? Their type of attack would dictate the response from the Ukrainian people and the world. One thing is for sure though, Joe Biden came out and said it himself, and that is that NATO would have Ukraine's back. NATO is comprised of a bunch of powerful nations that are united in supporting Ukraine here. Russia knows that if they were to launch an attack on Ukraine, that NATO's response would be swift and unforgiving. In the last video we did about this, we looked at who would win between these two superpowers, and we concluded that NATO would definitely have the advantage, but it's not such an overwhelming advantage that Russia couldn't pull something out. If NATO does get involved like they say they will, then things could get very bad very quickly. Sanctions are already being heavily applied to Russia, and that's only going to get worse if we enter a full-on war with them. Also, if it is NATO versus Russia, this has real potential to get other superpowers involved. It seems silly to think that China is going to sit back and chill just watching the chaos unfold. One has to believe that they would get involved in the fray in some capacity as well, although it's hard to determine exactly how or what they would do. If Russia attacked Ukraine tomorrow, then I would also think travel is going to get restricted pretty fast. I'm not exactly sure how this would all go down, but depending on the severity of the conflict, I could see it being impossible to travel to Russia in the near future. It's also been said by the Western allies that they want to target Russia's economy if they were to invade. So it seems like the beginning plan would be to send in enough troops to stop Russia from progressing and then apply major sanctions and other things to create a chokehold over the country's economy. This could potentially be successful, but it's also been said that Russia may then just turn to China as a trade partner and go there instead. This is all speculative and very far down the line, so there are a lot of variables involved in whether this is going to happen or not. Here's the stuff that we know for sure. Russia has tens of thousands of troops stationed very close to the borders of Ukraine. These troops were moved here for a specific reason, one that Putin and Russia refused to tell the rest of the world. If Russia was to invade Ukraine and Ukraine received no help at all, Ukraine would most likely lose to Russia. However, if Russia was to invade Ukraine, then Ukraine wouldn't be by themselves and NATO would come to their rescue very quickly. After this, though, is when things get hazy. What other countries get involved is unknown, and how far Russia wants to push this invasion is unknown as well. Ukraine still hopes they can resolve this with diplomacy, but at the end of the day, if Russia wants to own the country, then there really isn't any amount of diplomacy that can occur to stop them from trying to take it. Hopefully all of this is just a bunch of smoke and it doesn't actually happen, because if it does, who knows how bad this scenario could get. Can Ukraine defend a Russian invasion by itself? As we've been talking about on this channel a lot recently, Russia and Ukraine are not on the friendliest of terms right now. I suppose specifying and saying they aren't on the friendliest of terms right now might be a bit misleading though, because frankly, these guys have never really been on the friendliest of terms. These two countries have a deep and dark history between them that spans many generations. Considering we've talked pretty extensively about this in other videos recently, I'm not going to go too deep into it, just the Cole's Notes version. Basically, Ukraine hasn't been their own country for very long, only a bit over 30 years in fact. This is because for the longest time they were part of the Soviet Union. After World War II, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was founded, and this was connected to the Soviet Union. Therefore, during this period of time, Ukraine was not an independent nation, but was under control. They didn't gain their solidarity until 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved and a vote was held to see if the Ukrainian people wanted their independence. They definitely did, because a staggering 92.3% of the population voted voted to separate from Russia and become their own nation. Russia was never happy about this separation and has made it clear over the years that they believe Ukraine is an extension of Russia. An extension of Russia that they very much want back. This is part of the reason why Russia's putting a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian border right now. Ukraine has been getting closer to the possibility of joining NATO, something that would solidify their claim as a country on the world stage and give them some very powerful allies. It would also add a strong Western influence to Ukraine, which is something Russia definitely doesn't want for their next door neighbor. Russia and the United States certainly aren't on the best of terms, so having a strong United States ally right by them isn't in their best interest. So this is why we're in the situation right now where Russia has roughly 100,000 soldiers just chilling on the Ukrainian border, looking as if they could attack any day. Now, obviously, no one should want an invasion because, as many analysts have predicted, this could easily devolve into a full-on European war. Also, even if it didn't, then there would still be a ton of casualties from the Ukrainians and the Russians. But if we were to look at the worst possible scenario and say that Russia did invade Ukraine, would they be able to defend themselves? Well, before I fully delve into this question, I do want to say that they most likely wouldn't have to. NATO, the powerful alliance that Ukraine wants to become a part of, has said that it will come to Ukraine's aid if Russia attacks. The United States and Britain have been two of the most vocal in regards to their feelings about this potential invasion. Both Joe Biden and Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson have come out and warned Russia about the consequences of such an invasion, talking about how deadly it's going to be. In fact, the United States have already started mobilizing troops and moving them over to Europe. The other day, they announced that they were moving 3,000 troops to Eastern Europe. Now, even though 3,000 troops might seem like a lot, it really isn't when you consider the massive scale to Russia's army. However, that being said, 3,000 is still better than zero, so in reality, Ukraine will never need to defend its borders solely by itself. But on the off chance the United States pull all their forces back and NATO changes their mind, how would Ukraine fare against Russia? Well, short answer, not great. In a previous LBQ, I pulled this picture up of the Russian army versus the Ukrainian army, and I think now would be a good time to do that again. BBC released this image comparing the two, and as you can see, one side is definitely doing better than the other one. The difference in troops isn't horrible, like Russia definitely has an advantage here, but it isn't so overwhelming that Ukraine doesn't have a shot. What really isn't ideal for Ukraine though is how far behind they are in equipment. Russia literally has 15 times the attack aircraft that Ukraine has. They have way more tanks, way more armored vehicles, and way more artillery. At the end of the day, having troops is great, but they won't do a whole lot against the thousands of tanks that are rolling in. They also can't be that effective if there are enemy aircraft flying over top of them, dropping whatever they feel like on them. And this is sadly the reality of the situation. Most experts believe that even though the Ukrainian army has a lot of heart and a lot of fight, they would inevitably lose out because Russia would just absolutely dominate the air. Also, Russia would most likely own the Black Sea as well and dominate Ukraine in any naval battles that may take place. All of this doesn't bode well for Ukraine if they were left to fight by themselves. This is also only looking at one specific area of warfare and doesn't account for the whole other side of things. Strategy. Having the numbers in your favor is always a massive advantage, but as we've seen throughout history, a well thought out defense strategy can turn the tides of any battle. So with that being said, is it possible that Ukraine could just outmaneuver the Russians with some brilliant strategy? Well, nothing is impossible, but it's highly unlikely. In an article dedicated to this question, Mike Eckel writes, "How long could Ukraine's armed forces hold out against a bigger, more powerful military force like Russia's? Russia will find them a determined, robust, and enduring army, whatever Putin chooses to do," said Glenn Grant, a retired British Army artillery officer who served as an advisor to the Ukrainian military. The big challenge as I see it is not the military but the political. There is little faith in the country that the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and his administration are as prepared, thoughtful, and robust as the army and population at large. Much will depend upon what sort of attack Putin decides to follow. There is no appetite in the country for political surrender. So here's the big problem with what I just read there. The man who is being quoted is a retired army officer who worked as an advisor for Ukraine's military. He would have been there, in the room, seeing how they run their operation. If this man is already coming out and saying that he doesn't have faith in the leaders to be as prepared, thoughtful, or robust, then I personally have a very hard time seeing how they're gonna out-strategize the Russians. It should also be noted that those 98 attack aircraft that the Ukrainians have and other equipment isn't in the best of conditions. Mike Eckel also writes, much weaponry and equipment remains outdated with large numbers of old vehicles or old technology. The Air Force is a small fleet of Soviet helicopters and aging fighter jets whose effectiveness is questionable and would likely be wiped out quickly in the event of a major new Russian incursion, experts say. So the limited things that Ukraine does have access to aren't even in the best condition and are severely outdated. Also, most of it was the Russians to begin with. Basically, Ukraine is in a lot of trouble. Their defense also hangs heavily on how Russia chooses to attack them in the first place. The Center for Strategic and International Studies released a great article detailing the 3 possible invasion routes. The 3 routes, as they say, are the northern route, the central route, and the southern route. The northern route, as they write, is where Russia could advance toward Kiev along 2 routes. The first would be 150 miles by road through Novi Yurkovichy, Chernihiv, and into Kiev. The second would be a 200-mile thrust through Topachon, Konotop, Nisiev, and into Kiev. If Minsk were to acquiesce to the use of its road and rail networks, the Russian army could outflank Ukrainian defenses around Kiev and approach them from the rear via a 150-mile axis of advance from Mazhyr, Belarus, to Korenstan, Ukraine, and finally to Kiev. The central route is where Russia could also advance due west along 3 routes. The first might include a 200-mile axis that moves through Belgrade, Kharkov, Poltava, and finally to Kremenchuk. The second might include a 140-mile axis thrust through Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and possibly another thrust from Donetsk to Dnipro. The third might involve Russian forces advancing along the coastline toward Mariupol, Berdyansk, and the Perekop Isthmus, connecting Crimea to Ukraine. And the southern route is where Russia could also advance across the Perekop Isthmus to take Kherson and the source of the fresh water for Crimea, and simultaneously toward the vicinity of Melitopol to link up with Russian forces advancing along the coast of the Sea of Azov. If Russia was to attempt option 5, this would be the main attack coupled with the assault along the coastline toward Mariupol and Berdyansk. But it would be the hardest to sustain logistically due to the lack of railway running along the Sea of Azov coast and the main direction of advance. So that's kind of the breakdown of some potential Russian invasion strategies, but considering Ukraine has no idea which one Russia will do, I don't know how much this is gonna help them. Ukraine is really not in a good spot here, and their best chance for success is to be as close with NATO as they possibly can be. Without their support, they will assuredly be taken over by the Russians in a matter of time. They may be able to hold out for a few weeks, maybe even a month or so, but eventually the overwhelming numbers and superior strategy will take hold, and they will lose.
Is Russia really pulling out of Ukraine? We have been watching the tensions between the two countries rise for months now, and people, including many world leaders, have been speaking about how best to respond to the situation, but it's been precarious to say the least. Everyone is worried, thousands of troops have been stationed at the borders of Ukraine, and while everyone says an invasion is imminent, the only people who seem to be denying it and swearing it's not is Russia. Just hours ago, news broke and our eyes turned over to Eastern Europe again as Russia began to withdraw some of its troops from the border. It's not exactly clear how many units are going to be withdrawn or how far the withdrawal will stretch, as there are currently units to the north, east, and south of Ukraine. If this ends up being confirmed, this will be the first step taken by Russia to de-escalate the crisis, which has brought Europe and the world closer to conflict than we've seen in decades. US President Joe Biden was even just just warning that a full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine would leave at least 100,000 civilians dead, and that it would truly ripple out and alter our world. I mean, threats were so imminent that the Ukrainian embassy was moved out of Kiev. Both the US and NATO in general have been putting pressure on the Russian president in order to get him to ease the tension, even threatening a quote swift and severe response to any invasion of Ukraine, and these repercussions would come in the form of sanctions. There was fear that these threats would only go on to further agitate the Russian leader, but with this news, perhaps things are exactly the opposite. Right now, both Ukraine and really the rest of the world are responding cautiously to the news. Military experts are warning that it's too soon to be sure of or really understand the extent of the de-escalation that is happening. Apparently, while the news of this was being broken, the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, had some thoughts and feelings about our involvement or our concerns over the potential invasion that he wanted to express. It is said that he has been mocking the Western world for most of the time the tensions have been rising, and that this move, in part, was to portray or prove that the talks of a potential war that were going on in the Western world were not only false, but seemingly hysterical. I mean, the foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova herself said, quote, February 15th, 2022 will go down in history as the day Western war propaganda failed, humiliated and destroyed without a single shot fired. And a spokesman for the Russian government asked reporters if the, quote, exact time of the start of war had been published. There have to be other motives for the removal of troops, though. Right? I mean, this couldn't have merely just been a ploy to mess with the West. That would be far too expensive and, for lack of a better term, a bit childish perhaps? It is possible that this move, although it's being made out to seem like a humiliation tactic, might have actually been a move to show diplomacy. NATO's chief has been welcoming signals for the last few days that would show that perhaps Russia may be looking for a diplomatic solution, but they were waiting for Russia to act and show their willingness. This might be the sign that these talks of finding a resolution should continue. That would be great. That is exactly what we want to see in these uncertain times, but the optimism should definitely be cautious. The situation is currently unfolding, and who knows what may happen. While the troops are leaving, they are leaving some military equipment behind, which could mean that they'll have an easier time regrouping should things unfortunately go that way. That is exactly the reason for the cautious optimism. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that there were signs of a diplomatic opening, but that, quote, the intelligence that we're seeing today is still not encouraging. He claims that from his point of view, the signals are mixed. He explained that Russian forces were building hospitals near Ukraine's borders and that more battalions were moving closer to the borders, which he says could, quote, only be constructed as preparation for an invasion. I don't want that to be true, but the evidence is certainly compelling. We can't just listen to what people say. There's a reason for the old adage, actions speak louder than words. It seems trivial at a time like this, in a scenario like this, but perhaps it really is the most meaningful. This is at the same time that Ukraine's foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba said that Kiev would only believe that Russia was moving towards de-escalation if they saw for themselves that Russian troops were being pulled back. If you're like me, you might be sitting there wondering why on earth Russia would have troops stationed at the border while also swearing that they're not going to invade. I mean, we're not talking about a small amount of troops either. We're talking about upwards of 100,000. That's a lot of people being moved just to say that nothing at all is going to happen. It's fishy at best, and Putin's answer for it? Well, he says that Russia can exercise troops on its own territory as it sees fit. I mean, that's definitely true, but there's perhaps better ways to do it. It's also important to note that not even 20 hours, not even a full day prior to this announcement of the removal of some troops, a US official told the media that some of the Russian troops taking part in the drills had started to move into, quote, attack positions close to the Ukrainian border. Just another red flag to go along with the surprising announcement. Here's the thing, in late December of last year, there were some similar claims that were coming from Moscow, similar claims of de-escalation, but what we saw on the ground did not align with what was being said. Another thing that is most certainly worth mentioning is that for weeks now, officials have been warning that just a regular old-fashioned invasion might not be the only attack on Ukraine that we should be worried about. They've explained that a ground attack could come from Russia or Belarus, but it might also come in the form of a cyber attack, or perhaps what is called a false flag attack, which is staged to look like an assault by Ukrainian forces against pro-Russian fighters, which would then potentially put Russia in a position where they might use that as a sort of precursor to launch an invasion. Basically, it means that we should be watching from all angles and really looking at it critically. We have many different technologies available to us now that changes things a lot when it comes to times and tensions like these. This is all to say that there is a small glimmer of hope and optimism that Russia is really pulling back troops, but when we look at the bigger picture and the evidence, or really lack thereof, things still aren't looking great. There's no proof to back these claims, and in fact there's proof of the exact opposite. I mean, after Russia claimed they were pulling back troops, they still went on, just today, to take part in military drills in the Gomel region of Belarus. These drills included an OTR-21 Tochka-U missile system launching projectiles into the sky. Kind of a bizarre thing to do after speaking of de-escalation. Right now, the best thing we can hope for is that the talks amongst the US and NATO go well. Putin has said that he's ready for talks after the news of the US and NATO rejecting his wishes for them to keep Ukraine, as well as other former Soviet republic, out of NATO. They rejected this idea and a few others, but they have expressed their desire to discuss a range of security measures that Russia has previously proposed. Putin has said that he is ready to discuss things like limiting the deployment of intermediate-range missiles in Europe, the transparency of drills, and other sorts of measures similar to this that would help build the confidence, but he also expressed that he needs the West to agree to his main demands. This of course means that while he's seemingly open to conversation, who knows what may happen if both parties continue to reject some of his previous demands. The situation is obviously unfolding before our very eyes, and things can change in an instant. It's tough to say for sure what might happen, but there are arguments on both sides to remain as cautious as possible, but also remain optimistic that perhaps we won't see a war after all. These next few days will certainly be critical to seeing how this all plays out.